1863, in the spring of 1863, when Union soldiers were ordered to clear out the abandoned governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama, they expected dust, broken furniture, maybe a few state papers left behind in the chaos of war. What they found instead was sealed away for more than 90 years. While inspecting the mansion's library, a corporal noticed a section of wood paneling that didn't sound right. Behind that false wall lay a discovery so explosive the War Department locked it under classified status until the mid-20th century. Inside were 47 letters, a leather-bound journal, and a small case of daguerreotype photographs, each one a piece of a scandal that should never have survived the fire of history. The letters were exchanges between Alabama's governor and his personal physician, quietly discussing a pregnancy that, if exposed, would have destroyed the administration and toppled the governor's dynasty. The journal, kept by the governor's own wife, told the rest: a forbidden relationship, a secret that violated every law and racial code of the antebellum South, and photographs of a child who, according to every law of Alabama in 1863, should not have existed at all. The scandal began 15 years earlier, in 1848, when Governor Harrison Whitfield's wife Amelia gave birth to a son. That birth, certificate filed with the state register on March 19, 1848, lists the father as Harrison Whitfield and the mother as Amelia Catherine Whitfield. But those soldiers who found the hidden documents learned the truth. The child's biological father was an 18-year-old enslaved man named Samuel, owned by the governor himself. And this wasn't a case of assault or coercion. The letters and journal entries revealed something even more shocking. Amelia Whitfield had pursued this relationship deliberately, systematically, and with a strange mixture of calculation and genuine emotion that defied everything 19th century. Southern society claimed to understand about race, class, and power. What happened in the governor's mansion between 1847 and 1849 didn't just challenge Alabama's racial hierarchy. It exposed the contradictions at the heart of slavery itself. The ways, power, and desire complicated the simple narratives that justified the system, and it revealed how far people will go to protect reputation, even when truth becomes impossible to hide. Before we continue with the story of Amelia Whitfield and the scandal that consumed Alabama's first family, make sure you're subscribed and press that notification bell, because stories like this, stories buried in courthouse, archives, and sealed military records, don't appear in any history textbook. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Are you from Alabama? Does your hometown have secrets buried this deep in its past? Let me know. Now let's travel back to Montgomery, Alabama, in 1847, to a sweltering summer when everything began to unravel for the state's most powerful family. Montgomery, in 1847, was a city in transformation, caught between its frontier past and its ambitions of becoming a center of Southern power and culture. Only 7 years earlier, in 1840, Alabama's capital had moved from Tuscaloosa to Montgomery, bringing with it the machinery of state government. Hundreds of bureaucrats, lawyers, and office seekers who transformed what had been a modest river town into something approaching a true city. The population had swelled from 3,000 to over 6,000 in less than a decade, straining the infrastructure and creating a chaotic atmosphere that mixed old Alabama, families with ambitious newcomers. Cotton was absolute king in 1847. And Montgomery's position on the Alabama River made it the crucial shipping point for the vast cotton belt stretching across the state's interior. Riverboats lined the docks day and night, their smokestacks visible for miles across the flat landscape. Teams of enslaved workers loaded cotton bales aboard these vessels, working from dawn until long after dark during the peak shipping season. The docks themselves were a world unto themselves, populated by rivermen, cotton factors, merchants, gamblers, and prostitutes. It was a rough place, violent and lawless, kept barely in check by a handful of city constables who understood that maintaining order in the dock district meant choosing which crimes to ignore. Warehouses stretched along Commerce Street for half a mile, enormous brick and timber structures that could hold thousands of cotton bales. The smell of cotton, musty and organic, mixed with the river's smell of mud and fish and decay. During the summer months, the heat made the warehouse district almost unbearable. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees, and the humidity coming off the river felt like breathing through wet cloth. Yellow fever outbreaks were common, striking randomly, but hitting the poor and enslaved population hardest. The city's commercial district centered on Market Street, where shops sold everything from farm implements to fine china imported from England. There were dry goods, stores, groceries, taverns, boarding, houses, lawyers' offices, and more lawyers' offices. Alabama in 1847 was a litigious society where disputes over land, debts, and property, including human property, frequently ended up in court. A good lawyer could make a comfortable living in Montgomery, which partly explained why so many young men with legal training flocked to the capital. But what really defined Montgomery in 1847, what made it different from other southern cities of similar size, were the slave auctions held twice weekly in the courthouse square. These auctions were central to the city's economy and social life. Traders brought enslaved people from Virginia, Maryland, and the Corollas, where the soil was exhausted and the population of enslaved workers exceeded local demand. These people were sold in Montgomery to planters heading further west into Alabama's cotton belt or south into the newly valuable lands of Mississippi and Louisiana. The auctions were public spectacles. White families attended as if going to a market, examining the people for sale like livestock, checking teeth, muscles, scars. Enslaved people stood on auction blocks, often stripped to prove their physical condition, while auctioneers called out their qualities real and invented. Strong back, good breeder, no. Running tendency, literate, but not dangerously so. The language of the auctions reduced human beings to collections of attributes and potential economic value, a language everyone in Montgomery understood fluently because it was the language that built the city's prosperity. Beneath this commerce, in human flesh, ran currents of fear. White Montgomery in 1847 lived with constant anxiety about slave rebellion. The memory of Nat Turner's revolt in Virginia 16 years earlier had not faded. Every newspaper article about unrest in other states, every rumor of suspicious gatherings or mysterious fires fed this fear. The response was increased surveillance, harsher punishments, and laws designed to prevent enslaved people from organizing or even imagining resistance. Enslaved people caught without travel passes were whipped. Those suspected of planning rebellion were hanged, often without trial. The violence was systematic, calculated to terrorize, to make clear that any challenge to white supremacy would be met with overwhelming force. Yet this same white society that feared enslaved, people also depended on them for everything. Enslaved workers maintained the infrastructure, cooked the food, raised the children, built the buildings, and ran the households. This created a fundamental contradiction. How could enslaved people be dangerous enough to require constant surveillance and brutal punishment, yet trustworthy enough to handle the most intimate aspects of white family life? Montgomery's white population never satisfactorily answered this question. They simply lived within the contradiction, adjusting their beliefs to match their needs. The governor's mansion occupied 4 acres on Dexter Avenue, a 3-story federal-style building constructed in 1842 when the state decided it needed an official residence befitting Alabama's growing importance. The house featured 14 rooms, 8 fireplaces, a separate kitchen, building, stables, and quarters for the enslaved staff who maintained the property. In 1847, 15 people worked at the mansion, 8 men and 7 women, all owned, personally by Governor Whitfield, not by the state. Harrison Whitfield had become governor in January 1847 at age 46. He was Alabama's 7th governor, elected on a platform of expanding cotton production, supporting westward, expansion, and maintaining states' rights. He came from money. His father, Robert Whitfield, had made a fortune in tobacco in Virginia before moving to Alabama in 1821 when the state was barely 2 years old. Robert had purchased 35,000 acres in Dallas County, established a plantation he named Whitfield Manor, and built a personal fortune estimated at over $200,000 by the time of his death in 1843. Harrison inherited the plantation, 123 enslaved workers, and enough wealth to pursue politics without worrying about income. He'd served in the state legislature for 8 years before running for governor. He was considered competent rather than brilliant, reliable rather than inspiring. His political success owed as much to his father's money and connections as to his own abilities. But he was presentable, knew how to work the networks of Alabama power, and most importantly, he'd married well. Amelia Catherine Thornton had been 20 years old when she married Harrison Whitfield in 1839. She came from one of Mobile's oldest families. Her father, Judge Maxwell Thornton, sat on Alabama's Supreme Court. Her mother, Catherine Devo Thornton, was descended from South Carolina aristocracy, related to 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Amelia had been educated at a finishing school in Charleston, spoke French fluently, played piano competently, and had been raised to manage a large household with a kind of invisible efficiency that Southern society expected from women of her class. The marriage was strategic on both sides. Harrison gained connections to Mobile's legal and commercial elite. The Thornton family allied themselves with the Whitfield fortune and Harrison's political trajectory. Nobody asked whether the bride and groom actually loved each other. Love was considered pleasant, but optional. What mattered was that both families benefited from the union. Amelia gave birth to a daughter, Caroline, in 1841. The child was healthy, beautiful, and everything a firstborn should be. But the pregnancy had been difficult. Amelia had spent 5 months confined to bed, suffering from complications her doctors couldn't quite explain. When Caroline was finally born, Dr. Edmund Pritchard, the physician who attended the birth, told Harrison privately that Amelia should not attempt another pregnancy. Her constitution wouldn't survive it. Harrison accepted this news with disappointment, but resignation. He had an heir, even if that heir was female. He also had a nephew, his brother's son, who could inherit the Whitfield name if necessary. The important thing was that Amelia had survived, and they could continue their lives without the disruption of additional children. Amelia herself felt differently. The years following Caroline's birth were marked by a growing sense of purposelessness that she struggled to articulate even in her private journals. She performed her duties as governor's wife with the efficiency expected of her, hosting dinners for legislators and their families, managing the mansion's complex household operations, appearing at state functions, wearing the right clothes, and saying the right things. But something inside her had fundamentally shifted during those long months of bed rest during her pregnancy. She'd had time to think, truly think, perhaps for the first time in her life. Her childhood in Mobile had been carefully structured, every hour accounted for, every activity designed to prepare her for exactly the role she now occupied. She'd been taught French, music, drawing, needlework, the management of servants, the art of conversation that revealed nothing important, the skill of maintaining household accounts, and the supreme importance of reputation. She'd learned what every Southern lady learned, that her value lay in her ability to ornament her husband's life without ever challenging it. To produce heirs without making pregnancy seem too physical or real, to manage enslaved workers without violence that undergirded that management. But during those months confined to bed, unable to perform her usual duties, Amelia had started reading differently. Not the novels and poetry that were considered appropriate for ladies, but the books in Harrison's library that he'd never imagined she'd touch. Political philosophy, economic theory, histories that grappled with the contradictions of democracy and slavery coexisting. She'd always been intelligent, but she'd learned to hide that intelligence beneath the performance of femininity that society demanded. Now, temporarily freed from performing, she allowed herself to actually think about what she read. She saw the enslaved women who raised Caroline, particularly Dina, a woman of about 30 who'd been separated from her own children when they were sold to a Mississippi planter 3 years earlier. Dina loved Caroline with the focused intensity of someone trying to fill a void that could never be filled. She sang to her, told her stories, stayed up with her during fevers and nightmares. Amelia watched this and understood that the claim that enslaved people couldn't truly love their children was a lie necessary to justify separating families at auction blocks. Dina loved her lost children exactly as Amelia loved Caroline. The only difference was that society granted Amelia the right to keep her child while Dina had no such right. She noticed how her husband and his colleagues spoke about enslaved workers, simultaneously claiming they were childlike and inferior, while exploiting their labor in ways that required significant skill and judgment. The cook who prepared elaborate meals for the governor's dinner parties wasn't simple or childlike. The enslaved man who managed the mansion's accounts wasn't incapable of learning. The carpenter who designed and built furniture for the house wasn't inferior in intelligence. The lie of inferiority had to be maintained because the alternative was admitting that slavery was simply violence, that the only thing separating enslaved from free was power, backed by law, backed by guns. She observed the contradictions that white society refused to acknowledge. If enslaved people were truly inferior, why did white families trust them with their most intimate needs, their children's care, their food preparation, their personal grooming? Why did planters fear slave rebellions if the enslaved were as docile and simple as they claimed? Why were laws necessary to prevent teaching enslaved people to read if they were incapable of learning? Why did rape by white men of enslaved women happen constantly if enslaved women were as unattractive and inferior as white society insisted? These thoughts were dangerous. Amelia knew that they challenged everything her world was built on. She kept them private, recorded them in a journal. She hid in her wardrobe behind her winter dresses and never spoke them aloud, but they festered, growing into a kind of intellectual rebellion that had nowhere to go. She couldn't share these ideas with Harrison, who would have been horrified. She couldn't discuss them with other women of her class, who would have thought her mad or dangerous. She couldn't even fully articulate them to herself because she lacked the vocabulary and conceptual framework to name what she was seeing. This growing dissonance between what she was taught to believe and what she observed created a kind of internal pressure that built over years. She felt trapped not just by her marriage, which was loveless, but not unusually so by the standards of their class, but by the entire system she lived within. She was property, albeit property of a different kind than the enslaved workers. She couldn't own anything independently. She couldn't vote. She couldn't leave her marriage without losing her child and her social position. Her body belonged to her, husband to produce children or not, as he decided. The only power she had was indirect, exercised through influence and manipulation, and that power depended entirely on maintaining her reputation and her husband's favor. She began to understand that the system that enslaved black people also enslaved her, though in vastly different ways, with vastly different consequences. She had shelter, food, security, social position, things the enslaved population could only dream of. But she shared with them a fundamental lack of autonomy, a lack of legal personhood, a reduction to property rather than fully human agent. This recognition didn't make her equivalent to enslaved people. She understood that she still benefited enormously from white supremacy, but it created a sense of kinship, however problematic, that made her see the humanity in enslaved workers with unusual clarity for someone of her position. It was in this state of mind that Amelia first truly noticed Samuel. Samuel had been purchased by Harrison in 1846 at a Charleston auction, part of the estate sale, following the death of a merchant named Richard Hayes, who died of yellow fever. He was 17 at the time, unusually tall at just over 6 feet, with features that suggested mixed ancestry several generations back. His skin was dark brown, but his facial features showed European influence, a legacy of generations of racial mixing that slavery simultaneously created and denied. Hayes had been an unusual owner, a merchant who'd never married and had no children of his own. He'd purchased Samuel when Samuel was 8 years old, buying him from a Virginia planter who was selling off young slaves to pay debts. Hayes had needed someone to help in his warehouse and office, and he'd recognized something in the boy. Intelligence that showed in his eyes even at 8 years old. Rather than putting Samuel to hard physical labor, Hayes had taught him to read and write, to keep accounts, to manage correspondence. This education was illegal. South Carolina, like Alabama and most slave states, prohibited teaching enslaved people to read. The rationale was simple. Literacy was dangerous. An enslaved person who could read might read abolitionist newspapers, might forge travel passes, might read the Constitution and recognize the contradiction between all men are created equal and their own bondage. Might read the Bible and notice that Jesus had far more to say about caring for the poor than about obeying masters. Literacy created the possibility of intellectual independence, and intellectual independence was incompatible with slavery. But Hayes had ignored these laws partly because he needed Samuel's skills and partly because he seemed genuinely interested in Samuel's intellectual development. He'd given Samuel books, discussed ideas with him, treated him almost like a son, albeit a son who remained property and could be sold at any moment. Samuel had spent 9 years in Hayes' household, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but geography, history, some Latin, basic accounting practices. He'd become invaluable to Hayes' business, operations, managing increasingly complex tasks as he grew older. Hayes' death from yellow fever in 1846 had been sudden. One day, he was fine. 3 days later, he was dead. His body turned, yellow and his organs failing in the characteristic pattern of the disease. His estate, including Samuel, went to auction to pay his debts and distribute assets to distant relatives. Samuel found himself on an auction block for the second time in his life, this time educated and skilled, which made him both more valuable and more dangerous. Harrison had been in Charleston on business and had attended the auction out of curiosity. He'd been looking for an enslaved worker who could manage household accounts and correspondence at the governor's mansion. The previous man who'd handled these tasks had been sold after being caught stealing small amounts of money. Harrison needed someone with proven skills and ideally someone who understood the importance of discretion. When Samuel was brought onto the auction block and the auctioneer described his literacy and accounting skills, Harrison had been immediately interested. The bidding had been competitive. Other buyers recognized Samuel's value, but Harrison had the advantage of his position and wealth. He'd purchased Samuel for $850, a high price that reflected Samuel's education and skills. Samuel had been transported to Montgomery in chains, despite his education, because the law required it. Enslaved people traveling between states had to be restrained to prevent escape attempts. The first months at the governor's mansion had been a period of careful adjustment for Samuel. He'd learned the rhythms of the household, the expectations of his role, the personalities of the other enslaved workers. The mansion maintained a strict hierarchy among the enslaved staff. The house servants, who worked inside and had direct contact with the governor and his family, occupied the top of this hierarchy. Below them were the stable workers, gardeners, and laborers who maintained the grounds. Lowest were the workers who handled the dirtiest, most physical labor, mucking stables, hauling water, maintaining the privies. Samuel's literacy and his role managing accounts gave him an ambiguous position in this hierarchy. He was clearly valued by Harrison, which gave him status and protection, but the other enslaved workers also viewed him with suspicion. His education set him apart, made him seem potentially dangerous or untrustworthy. There was always the possibility that he might report infractions to Harrison, might use his proximity to power against them. Samuel understood this suspicion and tried to navigate it carefully, making clear that he wasn't an informant, while also maintaining the professional distance his position required. He'd been at the governor's mansion for 6 months when Amelia began to notice him in ways that went beyond the usual invisibility of servants. At first, his attention to her attention had been pure survival instinct. An enslaved man learned to read white people's moods and intentions, learned to anticipate what they wanted before they asked, learned to make himself invisible when visibility might be dangerous, and useful when usefulness was required. So when Amelia started watching him, Samuel noticed immediately and felt the first stirrings of fear. But Amelia's attention didn't feel predatory, at least not in the ways Samuel had learned to recognize. She wasn't looking at him the way white men sometimes looked at enslaved women with naked appetite barely concealed. She wasn't looking at him with the casual cruelty that some white people directed at enslaved workers, the look that said, "You are an object, and I am deciding how to use you." Instead, she seemed curious, almost uncertain, watching him the way someone might watch a puzzle they're trying to solve. She began finding excuses to speak with him. Small things. At first that seemed innocent enough. She would ask about household accounts, wanting to know details that most white women of her class never concerned themselves with. She would request that he retrieve books from the library, specific titles that seemed chosen to test whether he could read the spines and find the right volume. She would inquire about correspondence that needed Harrison's attention, asking Samuel to explain the content and context in ways that required him to demonstrate comprehension, not just literacy. Samuel responded with perfect deference, never meeting her eyes directly unless she specifically requested it, always maintaining the careful distance that survival required. He called her Ma'am or Mrs. Whitfield, never her first name, always stood until she gave him permission to sit, always left a room walking backward if she was still present. These were the rituals of slavery, the performances of subordination that kept enslaved people alive. But beneath that difference, Amelia sensed something else. A mind, working, thinking, observing, evaluating. She began testing that intelligence in small ways that seemed innocent, but carried enormous risk. She would leave books in places where Samuel would find them while performing his duties. Not religious texts or agricultural manuals, which were sometimes permitted for enslaved people to read, but books of poetry by Byron and Shelley, philosophical works by Locke and Rousseau, political theory about natural rights and the social contract, even novels that grappled with questions of justice and morality. She never acknowledged these books directly, never asked if he'd read them, never created a situation where Samuel would have to admit his literacy in a way that could be used against him. But she noticed when they'd been moved, noticed when pages seemed to have been turned, noticed when a book she'd left was returned to a slightly different position. One afternoon in late August, 1847, Amelia found Samuel in the library, alphabetizing a collection of law books that Harrison had acquired. She entered quietly, and for a moment Samuel didn't notice her presence. She saw him pause at a particular volume. Open it, read a passage. His expression shifted, something passing across his face that suggested both comprehension and frustration. Then he noticed her, and the expression vanished, replaced by that careful neutrality. "That volume interests you?" Amelia asked. Samuel closed the book immediately, lowering his eyes. "I apologize, ma'am. I was only arranging them as the governor instructed." "You were reading," Amelia said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact." Samuel stood frozen, trapped. Admitting he could read was dangerous. Denying it when she'd clearly witnessed him reading was also dangerous. He chose silence. Amelia moved closer, taking the book from his hands. It was a collection of Enlightenment philosophy. Essays by Locke and Montesquieu about natural rights and the social contract. "Do you understand what these men are arguing?" she asked. Still, Samuel said nothing. "I won't tell my husband," Amelia said quietly. "I'm simply curious. You've been reading the books I've left out. I've watched you. You understand them, don't you?" Samuel met her eyes for the first time. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications neither could fully acknowledge. Finally, he spoke. "The books argue that all men are born with certain rights, that government exists to protect those rights, that any government that fails in this duty has broken its contract with the governed." "And what do you think of these arguments?" Amelia asked. "I think," Samuel said carefully, "that these philosophers did not imagine men like me when they wrote about natural rights." Amelia nodded slowly. "No, they didn't. Or perhaps they did, and chose to ignore the contradiction." This conversation marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, these encounters became more frequent. Amelia would find Samuel in the library or the office or the hallway, and they would talk, always briefly, always aware that discovery would be catastrophic, but with increasing openness. Amelia brought him more challenging books. She asked his opinions on what he read. She shared her own thoughts, ideas she could never voice to her husband or their social circle. What began as intellectual curiosity evolved into something more complicated. Amelia found herself thinking about Samuel constantly. She noticed physical details, the way his hands moved when he spoke, the curve of his mouth when he almost smiled at something. She said the intelligence in his dark eyes. She told herself this was simply fascination with a mind trapped in circumstances that prevented its full expression. But she knew she was lying to herself. Samuel felt the danger more acutely. He understood what was happening, understood the terrible risk. In Alabama, in 1847, an enslaved man who looked at a white woman with anything resembling desire could be killed. The fact that this particular white woman was the governor's wife made the situation even more lethal. He tried to pull back to re-establish the proper distance, but Amelia wouldn't let him. She sought him out constantly, created opportunities for conversation, pushed past the barriers he tried to maintain. By October, their conversations had moved beyond books and philosophy. They spoke about their lives, their thoughts, their dreams. Samuel told Amelia about his childhood, about watching his mother sold away when he was 7, about learning to read in secret from his previous owner's son, about the constant fear that shaped every moment of an enslaved person's existence. Amelia told Samuel about her own imprisonment, different in kind, but real nonetheless. Trapped in a marriage without love, bound by social expectations that allowed her no authentic self, denied any purpose beyond decoration and reproduction, they both knew where this was heading. Neither could seem to stop it. The first time they touched was in early November. Amelia had asked Samuel to help her retrieve a book from a high shelf in the library. He reached up to pull the volume down, and his hand brushed against hers. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, everything changed. They stood there, hands touching, looking at each other, and the pretense that this was simply intellectual companionship shattered. "We can't," Samuel said, quietly. "I know," Amelia whispered. But they didn't move apart. Over the next weeks, their physical relationship developed with the same dangerous inevitability as their emotional connection. They were careful, meeting only when Harrison was away, only in rooms where they could hear approaching footsteps, only at times when other household staff were occupied elsewhere. The risk was insane, the potential consequences catastrophic, but neither could stop. Amelia told herself she was rebelling against a system that denied her autonomy, that treated her as property just as surely as it treated Samuel as property, that refused to acknowledge her as a full human being, capable of making her own choices. Samuel told himself he had no real choice, that he was still enslaved, still bound to obey, still powerless despite Amelia's claims that this was what she wanted. Both explanations were true and false simultaneously, complicated by power dynamics that made genuine consent impossible, while also making their connection feel more real than anything else in their lives. By December, Amelia was pregnant. She recognized the signs immediately, the same nausea she'd experienced with Caroline, the same sensitivity to smells, the same overwhelming exhaustion. But this time, terror accompanied those symptoms. Terror because she knew this child could not be Harrison's. Terror because she understood what discovery would mean. Her first instinct was to tell Samuel she found him in the office one evening, waited until they were alone, and said simply, "I'm pregnant." Samuel's face went ashen. "No," he breathed. "No, that's not possible." "It is," Amelia said, "and it's yours." Samuel sat down heavily, his hands shaking. "They'll kill me," he said. "You understand that? When anyone realizes, when the child is born, when people see, they'll kill me." "No one will know," Amelia said with more conviction than she felt. "Harrison will think the child is his. He hasn't touched me in months, but he won't remember that. Men never do. He'll be thrilled to have another heir. And when the child looks like me," Samuel asked, "when the child is born with features that make it clear what happened, what then?" Amelia had no answer. Because Samuel was right. Mixed race children often showed their ancestry. And even when features were ambiguous, whispers would begin. Servants would notice. Doctors would notice. And once suspicion took root, nothing could stop it from growing. The next 3 months were a special kind of torture. Amelia announced her pregnancy to Harrison, who reacted with pleasure mixed with concern. Remembering how difficult her previous pregnancy had been. He immediately called Dr. Pritchard, who examined Amelia and confirmed the pregnancy while warning again about the risks. Amelia endured these examinations, these discussions about her body and her health, while knowing the entire time that the child growing inside her would destroy everything if its parentage became known. She continued to see Samuel, though now their meetings were marked by desperation rather than joy. They spoke about impossible futures, about running away together, about somehow surviving what was coming. But both knew these were fantasies. Amelia had resources, but she couldn't access them without Harrison's permission. Samuel had nothing. The idea that they could simply disappear together was absurd. In March 1848, Amelia went into labor. The birth was attended by Dr. Pritchard, 2 midwives, and Harrison, who waited anxiously downstairs. The labor lasted 14 hours. Finally, on March 19th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Amelia delivered a healthy boy. Dr. Pritchard cleaned the infant, examined him thoroughly, and wrapped him in blankets before presenting him to Harrison. The governor looked at his son, counting fingers and toes, examining the tiny face, and saw what he expected to see, a Whitfield heir. The baby's skin was fair, his features indistinct in the way of all newborns. Harrison announced he would name the boy Thomas after his own grandfather, but Amelia, lying exhausted in her bed, saw something else. She saw Samuel's eyes looking back at her from her son's face. She saw the shape of Samuel's mouth, the curve of his brow. She knew that as the child grew, these features would become more pronounced, more recognizable, and she knew her time was running out. The first person to voice suspicion was Harrison's mother, Victoria Whitfield. She visited the mansion 2 weeks after Thomas's birth, ostensibly to meet her new grandson. But when she held the infant, something shifted in her expression. She stared at the child for a long moment, then looked at Amelia, with eyes that saw too much. "The baby has unusual features," Victoria said, carefully. "All babies look strange when they're new," Amelia replied, keeping her voice steady. "Yes," Victoria agreed, "but there's something about his coloring, his hair texture, the shape of his nose. Babies change so much in the first months." But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Victoria mentioned her concerns to Harrison, couching them in vague terms about the baby's health and development. Harrison dismissed her worries, seeing only what he wanted to see: his son, his heir. But Victoria wasn't convinced. She began watching the household more carefully during her visits. She noticed how Amelia looked at Samuel, noticed how Samuel seemed to avoid being in the same room as the baby, noticed the tension that crackled between them when they were forced into proximity. Victoria was a woman who'd spent 60 years navigating Southern society. Understanding its codes and contradictions, she recognized what she was seeing, even if the implications were so shocking that she could barely acknowledge them to herself. By the time Thomas was 3 months old, the whispers had begun among the household staff. Enslaved people noticed things that white employers thought invisible. They saw how the baby's skin was darkening slightly, how his hair was growing in with a different texture than Caroline's had. They noticed how Amelia watched Samuel, how Samuel looked haunted. They understood what had happened, even if they couldn't speak about it openly. These whispers reached Harrison through his valet, an enslaved man named Peter, who'd served the Whitfield family for 20 years. One evening in June, while helping Harrison dress for a dinner party, Peter mentioned casually that some of the household staff were confused about young Master Thomas's appearance. "What do you mean, confused?" Harrison asked. Peter chose his words carefully. "Just that the boy doesn't look much like your other child, sir." Some think he takes after his mother's family. Others say they've never seen a Whitfield or a Thornton with such features. Harrison waved this off. Babies change. Everyone knows that. But the seed Victoria had planted 3 months earlier was now being watered by Peter's insinuations. Harrison began to look at his son more critically. He compared Thomas to Caroline at the same age. He studied photographs of himself and Amelia as infants. And slowly, reluctantly, he began to see what others were noticing. His son didn't look like him, didn't look like Amelia, didn't look like anyone in either family. The revelation came in late July. Harrison confronted Amelia in their bedroom, closing the door. So no servants could overhear. "I need you to tell me the truth," he said quietly. "Is Thomas my son?" Amelia's first instinct was to lie, to maintain the pretense, to protect everyone involved. But looking at Harrison's face, seeing the knowledge already present in his eyes, she understood that lying would only make things worse. "No," she said simply. Harrison stood silent for a long moment, processing confirmation of what he'd begun to suspect. "Who?" he finally asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "Samuel," Amelia whispered. The sound Harrison made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Samuel," he repeated. "The enslaved man I purchased, the man I brought into my house. That Samuel?" "Yes." "How long?" Harrison asked. "How long were you?" He couldn't finish the sentence. 6 months, Amelia said, "from October until the pregnancy." Harrison's face twisted with rage and humiliation. 6 months under my roof. While I was governing this state, you were— He turned away, unable to look at her. "Do you understand what you've done? What this means?" "I understand," Amelia said quietly. "No," Harrison said sharply. "You don't. If this becomes known, if anyone learns the truth, I'm finished. Not just politically, socially, financially. Everything I've built, everything my father built, destroyed because you couldn't control yourself." "What will you do?" Amelia asked. Harrison spent the next 3 days locked in his study, seeing no one, speaking to no one. He was calculating, weighing options, considering possibilities. The truth was that his choices were limited. He could divorce Amelia, but divorce required publicly stating grounds, and he certainly couldn't admit the real reason. He could send her away, but that would invite questions, speculation, scandal. He could reveal everything, prosecute Samuel and probably Amelia as well under Alabama's laws against miscegenation and adultery, but that would destroy him along with them. The solution he arrived at was characteristically ruthless. He would maintain the fiction. Thomas would remain his legitimate son. Amelia would continue as his wife, at least publicly, but privately, everything would change. First, he dealt with Samuel. Late one night, Harrison summoned Samuel to his study. When the young man entered, Harrison was standing by the window, looking out at the darkened grounds. "I know," Harrison said without turning around. "I know about you and my wife. I know Thomas is yours." Samuel stood frozen, every muscle tensed for violence. "I should kill you," Harrison continued, still not looking at Samuel. "I should drag you outside right now and shoot you in the head. That's what any reasonable man would do. That's what's expected." "Sir," Samuel began, but Harrison cut him off. "Because killing, you would require explaining why, and I can't afford that explanation. But I am going to make you disappear." 2 days later, in the middle of the night, Samuel was taken from the mansion by 2 men Harrison trusted. He was transported to a ship in Mobile Bay, given forged, free papers identifying him as Samuel Freeman, and put aboard a vessel heading to New Orleans. From there, he was given enough money to reach Mexico, where slavery had been abolished 11 years earlier. Harrison had essentially bought Samuel's silence by giving him freedom. Gambling that Samuel would disappear into Mexico or beyond rather than risk returning to Alabama, where he could still be captured and sold, Samuel's disappearance was explained to the household staff as a sale. The governor had sold Samuel to a plantation owner in Texas. No one questioned this explanation, though several enslaved people at the mansion suspected the truth was more complicated. With Samuel gone, Harrison turned his attention to managing the scandal that hadn't yet broken, but threatened constantly. He moved Amelia and the children to the S family plantation in Dallas County, claiming that Amelia's health required country air. The mansion in Montgomery was suddenly much quieter, occupied only by Harrison and a skeleton staff during legislative sessions. Harrison visited Dallas County rarely. When he did, he treated Amelia with cold civility, acknowledging her presence without ever truly speaking to her. He never held Thomas, never played with him, never acknowledged him as anything more than an unfortunate necessity. Caroline, now 7 years old, sensed the change in her father's behavior, but couldn't understand it. Amelia lived in this strange purgatory for 2 years. She was still governor's wife in name, but she'd been effectively exiled from Montgomery society. Women who'd once sought her friendship now made excuses to avoid visiting. Invitations to social functions became rare, then stopped entirely. The official explanation was Amelia's delicate health. The unofficial, whispers spreading through Alabama's elite families suggested something far more scandalous, though no one could quite articulate what they suspected. In 1850, Harrison lost his bid for re-election. His opponent never explicitly mentioned the rumors about his family, but they hung in the air, nonetheless. Questions about his personal life, about his wife's absence from Montgomery, about whether a man who couldn't control his own household could be trusted to govern a state. Harrison lost by 8 percentage points. A humiliating defeat. After leaving office, Harrison retreated to the Dallas County plantation full-time, but he couldn't stand being in the same house as Amelia and Thomas. He built a separate residence on the property, a smaller house a half-mile from the main plantation home. He and Amelia lived as neighbors, not spouses, acknowledging each other only when absolutely necessary. Thomas grew up in this strange environment, loved intensely by his mother, ignored or barely tolerated by the man he believed was his father, watched constantly by household staff who knew his secret but couldn't speak it aloud. He was a beautiful child, with Amelia's fine features softened by Samuel's stronger bone structure. His skin tone fell somewhere between his parents', light enough that in winter he could almost pass for white, dark enough that in summer no one could pretend not to notice. His hair grew in thick and wavy, with a texture that defied easy categorization. His eyes were light brown, almost amber, startling in their clarity. He was intelligent, absorbing information with the same quick comprehension his father had shown. By age 4, he could read simple words. By 6, he was reading at a level that would have been advanced for a white child twice his age. Amelia taught him herself, recognizing that sending him to school would invite questions and comparisons she couldn't afford. She created lessons that covered not just reading and arithmetic, but history, geography, Latin, everything she'd learned in her own education and everything she'd taught herself since. But Thomas absorbed more than academic knowledge. He absorbed the tension that permeated the household, the unspoken knowledge that something was fundamentally wrong with his existence. He noticed how Harrison looked at him, or rather, how Harrison looked through him, as if Thomas were a ghost that Harrison had learned to ignore. He noticed how visiting relatives reacted to him, the questions in their eyes, even when their mouths remained polite. He noticed how the enslaved workers at the plantation watched him with a mixture of pity and weariness, as if he were a tragedy waiting to fully unfold. Caroline, 7 years older, loved her brother with a fierce protectiveness that suggested she understood more than anyone admitted. She defended him from the curious questions of other children, from the veiled comments of adults, from the isolation that his ambiguous position created. But even Caroline couldn't fully protect him from understanding that he was different, that his difference made people uncomfortable, that his very existence challenged something fundamental about the world they lived in. Thomas learned early that he lived in multiple worlds simultaneously without fully belonging to any of them. In the white world, he was the governor's son, but a son viewed with suspicion and discomfort. In the black world, he was the mistress's child, elevated above enslaved workers, but not one of them, benefiting from his mother's status while carrying the same blood that justified their bondage. He existed in a space between categories that 19th century Southern society had worked desperately to make impermeable and absolute. This in-between existence shaped everything about Thomas's development. He became quiet, careful, hyper-aware of how his presence affected others. He learned to read subtle cues in facial expressions and body language to understand what people weren't saying as clearly as what they said aloud. He developed a kind of double consciousness, seeing himself simultaneously as he saw himself and as others saw him. Always aware of the gap between these visions, the enslaved workers on the plantation, particularly the older women, showed Thomas a kindness that came from their own understanding of what it meant to exist in a world that denied your humanity. A woman named Ruth, who worked in the kitchen, would save him special treats, would tell him stories, would let him sit with her while she prepared meals. She never spoke directly about his parentage, but in small ways she made clear that she saw him, understood him, cared about him despite and because of the complications of his existence. Another enslaved man, a blacksmith named Moses, who was about 40 years old, took it upon himself to teach Thomas practical skills: how to shoe a horse, how to repair tools, how to work metal. These lessons were never formal, never acknowledged by Harrison or Amelia. But Moses seemed to recognize that Thomas would need skills beyond book learning, that his ambiguous position might someday require him to work with his hands in ways that white gentlemen's sons never had to. Moses never explained his reasoning, but Thomas understood the gift he was being given. These relationships between Thomas and the enslaved workers on the plantation created another layer of complexity. Thomas carried both privilege and precariousness simultaneously. He would never be sold, never be whipped, never face the daily violence that defined enslaved existence. But he also carried the knowledge that his safety depended entirely on maintaining a fiction, that any crack in that fiction could destroy not just him, but his mother and everyone who'd helped protect their secret. As Thomas grew older, approaching adolescence, the complications of his position intensified. His body was changing in ways that made his mixed ancestry more obvious rather than less. His features were settling into patterns that couldn't be easily explained by reference to Whitfield or Thornton family resemblance. Visitors to the plantation looked at him with increasing puzzlement, sometimes with barely concealed disgust, occasionally with a knowing contempt that suggested they'd figured out the truth, but were too polite or too cautious to say it aloud. Harrison's coldness toward Thomas deepened. During these years, he'd made his peace with maintaining the fiction of Thomas's legitimacy, understanding that any alternative would destroy him, socially and politically. But peace with necessity didn't mean acceptance or affection. He provided for Thomas, materially, ensured he was clothed and fed and educated, but he gave him nothing beyond these bare requirements. No warmth, no guidance, no acknowledgement of Thomas as a person rather than an obligation he'd been forced to shoulder. Amelia watched her son navigate these impossible circumstances with a mixture of pride and guilt. Pride because Thomas handled the situation with grace and intelligence far beyond his years. Guilt because she'd created this situation, had brought Thomas into a world that had no place for him, had satisfied her own needs without fully considering what it would mean for the child who resulted. She tried to make up for Harrison's coldness with her own doubled affection, but she knew this wasn't enough. A boy needed a father, and she'd given him a man who looked at him with barely disguised resentment when forced to look at him at all. The enslaved community on the plantation had their own reactions to Thomas that reflected the complexity of slavery itself. Some saw him as symbol of white hypocrisy, evidence that the racial boundaries white society claimed were absolute and natural were actually arbitrary and permeable. Others saw him as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a child who deserved compassion regardless of how he'd been conceived. Still, others viewed him with suspicion, wondering if he might someday use his white privilege against them, might become someone who upheld the system, despite carrying blood that marked him as other. These varying reactions created a social situation for Thomas that was constantly shifting, never stable. He learned to navigate these shifts with impressive skill, adapting his behavior to different audiences and contexts. With his mother, he could be himself, could voice the questions and fears he couldn't express elsewhere. With Harrison, he became invisible, speaking only when spoken to, removing himself from Harrison's presence as quickly as propriety allowed with the enslaved workers. He was respectful but not familiar, aware that any presumption of equality would be dangerous for everyone involved. With Caroline, he could be a child playing games and sharing confidences, pretending for brief moments that the world was simpler than it actually was. When Thomas was 7 years old in 1855, an event occurred that subtly shifted the dynamics of his existence. Victoria Whitfield, Harrison's mother and Thomas's nominal grandmother, fell seriously ill. She was 68 years old, and a winter respiratory infection had settled deep in her lungs. The doctors could do nothing but make her comfortable while her body slowly failed. She spent her last 2 weeks in a bedroom at the Dallas County Plantation, attended by Amelia and the household's enslaved workers who served as nurses. On her deathbed, lucid but clearly weakening, Victoria called Harrison to her side. She sent everyone else from the room, requesting privacy for her final conversation with her only surviving child. What she said to him in those moments was never recorded in any document, but Harrison's behavior afterwards then suggested the content of that conversation. According to Caroline, who listened at the door despite being told to leave, she heard her grandmother say, "That boy is not yours. You know it. I know it. Half of Alabama knows it. But he's still a child. He didn't choose any of this. Don't punish him for his mother's sins. Whatever Amelia did, whatever drove her to it, Thomas is innocent. He carries your name. Give him at least the acknowledgement that name should bring." Harrison's response, if he made one, was too quiet for Caroline to hear. But after Victoria died later that evening, something shifted in Harrison's treatment of Thomas. He didn't suddenly warm to the boy, didn't claim him as a true son, didn't offer the affection that a father should give a child. But he stopped pretending Thomas didn't exist. He began acknowledging Thomas's presence with brief nods. He occasionally asked Thomas about his studies, listening to the responses with something approaching attention if not interest. These were small changes, barely noticeable to anyone outside the immediate family, but for Thomas, who'd spent 7 years being treated as if he were a ghost in his own home, these small acknowledgments mattered enormously. For Amelia, watching her husband make these grudging concessions to decency toward their son, the changes produced something approaching gratitude, mixed with bitterness that this was the best she could hope for. The Civil War brought its own complications. Harrison was too old to fight, and his damaged reputation kept him from any significant role in Confederate leadership. But the war disrupted everything. The plantation's economy collapsed. The enslaved workers who'd maintained it fled to Union lines as Federal troops moved into Alabama. By 1863, the once prosperous Whitfield plantation was barely functional. Harrison died in 1864, 2 months before the war ended. He'd been ill for months with what doctors called consumption, but Amelia suspected it was something else. Bitterness, perhaps. Disappointment, the slow decay that comes from nursing resentment for too long. He was 63 years old. His funeral was sparsely attended. The few people who came paid respects more to his father's memory than to Harrison himself. With Harrison's death, certain truths could finally be acknowledged. Amelia gathered her children, Caroline, now 23, and Thomas, 16, and told them everything. She told Caroline that her father had died bitter and unforgiving. She told Thomas that Harrison was not his biological father, that his real father had been an enslaved man named Samuel, that he'd been born from a relationship that violated every law of Alabama, but had been the only real love Amelia had ever known. Thomas's reaction was complicated. Shock, certainly confusion about his identity, about who he really was, but also a strange sense of relief. The distance Harrison had maintained suddenly made sense. The way servants had looked at him throughout his childhood, the whispers he'd never quite understood, all of it clicked into place. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked. "To Samuel?" "My father." "Your father arranged for him to go to Mexico." Amelia said he was given freedom and money to start somewhere new. "I don't know if he survived the journey. I don't know if he's still alive. I've tried to find out, but there's been no word." Thomas absorbed this information silently. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Did you love him?" "Yes," Amelia said without hesitation. "I loved him and I believe he loved me. But we were trapped in a system that made our love impossible, that punished it as a crime. You were born from that. Love, Thomas. And whatever your legal father believed, whatever society says, you are not a mistake." After the war ended, Amelia and her children moved to New York. They reinvented themselves, claiming to be from Virginia, a state so devastated by the war that records were impossible to verify. Caroline married a merchant in 1867 and had 4 children. Thomas became a school teacher, working in schools for freed slaves, teaching, reading, and writing to people who'd been denied education under slavery. He never married, never had children of his own, but he dedicated his life to education as a tribute to the father he'd never known, who'd used literacy as a form of resistance. Amelia lived until 1883, dying at age 64 in a modest apartment in Manhattan. Among her possessions, her children found the journal she'd kept throughout her life. In her final entry, written 3 days before her death, she reflected on everything that had happened. "I broke every rule of the society I was born into." She wrote, "I violated laws, betrayed my husband, brought scandal to my family. By the standards of the world I came from, I am guilty of terrible sins. But I loved Samuel, and that love produced Thomas, and Thomas has become a better man than anyone from my old life ever dreamed possible. So I cannot regret what I did. I can only regret that Samuel and I couldn't have a life together, that our son never knew his father, that we had to hide the truth for so long. But the love was real, and real love is worth any price. The letters and documents discovered by Union soldiers in 1863 were eventually declassified in 1954. A historian researching Alabama's Civil War governors found them in military archives and realized their significance. He attempted to trace what happened to everyone involved. Samuel's fate remained mysterious. No records existed of a Samuel Freeman in Mexico or anywhere else that matched his description. He simply vanished, whether into death or into successful anonymity. No one could determine. Amelia's descendants, contacted by the historian, were shocked to learn the truth about their ancestry. Some embraced the revelation, proud that their great-great-grandmother had defied the racist laws of her time. Others rejected it, insisting the documents must be forgeries. The family fractured over how to understand this history. Thomas's legacy lived on in the schools he helped establish. Several historically black colleges in the Northeast trace part of their founding to his work. Students he taught went on to become leaders in their communities. Teachers themselves, advocates for education and racial justice. They never knew that their teacher was born from a forbidden relationship that embodied both the cruelty and the strange possibilities of slavery's twilight years. Harrison Whitfield's name appears in Alabama history books as a footnote. One of the state's lesser governors, noted mainly for losing his re-election bid and for leaving office under a cloud of unspecified personal scandal. His actual story, the truth about his family, remained hidden until the historian's discovery in the 1950s. Even then, Alabama's official histories tend to gloss over the details, mentioning the scandal. Only in passing or not at all, the governor's mansion, where it all happened, still stands on Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, now a museum. Thousands of tourists visit each year, walking through rooms where Harrison conducted state business, where Amelia hosted dinner parties, where Samuel managed accounts and correspondence. The mansion's official history mentions that Governor Whitfield's wife was often in poor health and spent much time at the family's country property. It does not mention why. It does not mention Samuel. It does not mention the baby born in 1848 who grew up carrying secrets that shaped Alabama history in ways the state has never fully acknowledged. The hidden room where Union soldiers found the documents was sealed again after the letters were removed. It remains sealed today, though historians occasionally petition for access, hoping to find additional evidence. The mansion staff refuses these requests, citing structural concerns and the need to preserve the building's historical integrity. But people familiar with the situation suspect the real reason is that Alabama still isn't ready to confront this particular chapter of its past. What remains undeniable is that in 1847 and 1848, in the heart of Alabama's capital, at the peak of slavery's power, two people formed a connection that defied everything their society believed about race and power and the unbridgeable distance between enslaved and free. Whether that connection was love or exploitation or some complicated mixture of both depends on perspective, on how much weight you give to Amelia's agency versus the fundamental power imbalance inherent in slavery. Amelia claimed it was love. Samuel never had the chance to record his version. Their son tried to honor both of them by dedicating his life to education and justice. The story of Amelia Whitfield and Samuel exposes the lies slavery required. The lie that racial categories were fixed and immutable. The lie that enslaved people were incapable of intellectual or emotional equality with white people. The lie that slavery's violence existed only in physical chains and whips, when in fact it manifested in every relationship between enslaved and free, twisting desire and affection into something that could never be simple or pure because it existed within a system designed to dehumanize. Amelia and Samuel's relationship and the child born from it challenged the fundamental logic of slavery. If an enslaved man and the governor's wife could connect intellectually and emotionally, if their child could grow up to become an educated, accomplished person, then the entire justification for slavery collapsed. That's why the scandal had to be buried. That's why Harrison chose to hide the truth rather than expose it. Because the truth was too dangerous, too revolutionary, too destructive to the social order that his entire world depended on. We'll never know if Samuel survived his journey to Mexico. We'll never know if he thought about Amelia and Thomas and whatever life he built. We'll never know if the freedom Harrison bought him felt like a gift or another form of exile. His silence in the historical record is itself a statement about who gets to tell their story and who disappears into the gaps of history. But Thomas's life stands as evidence that he existed. Every student Thomas taught, every school he helped build, every lesson in reading and writing he provided to people emerging from slavery's shadow. These were testimony to Samuel's life and his value. In teaching literacy to freed slaves, Thomas was continuing his father's work, using the same skill that had made Samuel valuable and dangerous, and passing it on to others who would use it to claim their own freedom and dignity. Was she a woman who found genuine love in an impossible situation, or someone who exploited the fundamental power imbalance of slavery while convincing herself it was love? Can we judge her by modern standards? Or do we need to understand her within the context of 1840s Alabama? And what about Samuel? Did he have any real agency in this relationship, or was he trapped by circumstances that made saying no impossible? These aren't easy questions, and I don't claim to have definitive answers, but they're questions worth asking because they force us to confront the complicated, messy reality of American history rather than the simplified narratives we often tell ourselves. If this story made you think, if it challenged your assumptions about the past, let me know in the comments. Share this video with someone who appreciates history that doesn't shy away from difficult truths. Subscribe to Whispers and Frames for more stories about America's hidden past, the scandals buried in courthouse archives, the secrets that shaped history in ways we're only beginning to understand. And remember, the past is never as simple or as distant as we like to believe. The choices people made in 1847 still echo through our world today in ways we're still working to understand. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next